Assistant Professor Sam Hurst, a faculty member at Bilkent University's Department of International Relations, has authored a study that has made a splash in the academic world. Oxford University Press published Against the Liberal Order. This year, we interviewed with the Dr. Hurst to talk about his current book. His interest in Soviet-Turkish relations started at a young age when he researched the countries opposite the Western power. Dr. Hurst has been researching on this subject for many years.
And I learned that the Soviet Union and Turkey had cooperated in the early 1920s. And to me, this was a really interesting response to Western power. Because you had one communist state, another anti-communist, and yet they found common cause. And so I was interested in thinking about responses to Western power. That's how I came to the subject of my book.
Dr. Hurst visited the factory in Nazilli to elaborate on the fig trade at the beginning of his book and says living in two countries was very useful for his book.
I've spent probably 20 years of my life living in Russia and Turkey, and without that extensive time in these two countries, I don't think I would have had a local perspective. So my book opens with a story of fig trade between the Soviet Union and Turkey. And it took me visiting the factory in Nazilli to understand how important that piece of context was. Because I visited Nazilli in late August or September, and everywhere, as far as the eye could see, there were figs. And I was looking at this, and for the first time I said, okay, this is what comparative advantage looks like. This is what an area blessed with natural abundance looks like. And yet the Soviet and Turkish states decided to build a factory in this area. And so that was something I had to explain. And there are cases after cases in my book that really draw on observations of the local and then tie it to that broader story about the opposition to Western power that I referred to in answer to your first question.
While the resource imbalance was one of the biggest challenges he faced, he resorted to a different method to turn his situation in his favor.
So certainly there were many challenges. I think perhaps one of the greatest challenges was a real imbalance in sources. The revolutionaries who came out of the Russian Empire, they were convinced that they were doing something of world historical importance. So they were really interested in process, and they kept detailed records of what they were doing and discussed what they were doing because they imagined this would be an example, a model for the rest of the world. The Turkish revolutionaries who came out of the Ottoman Empire were less process-focused and more ends-focused. They wanted to demonstrate that Turkey as a nation had arrived. And so I had lots and lots of sources on the Soviet side and fewer on the Turkish side. And I had to figure out how to address that imbalance. And ultimately what I did in the book was to really adopt a Soviet perspective, but to tell a story about Turkey.
Publications on modern Turkey have fewer publishing alternatives than publications on the Soviet Union and the Cold War, and he took this into consideration when reaching out to publishers.
Take that story that has a real specific and particular cultural history and tell it in a way that would appeal to a broader audience in the Anglophone world. And so that's how I arrived at, one part of how I arrived at the title, Against the Liberal Order, which really makes an argument about broader world politics.
Dr. Hurst loves being in the Bilkent University. It is very important for him to communicate and work together with the students.
As an academic, a lot of the things that I do are gratifying, but that gratification is delayed. It took me a very, very long time to write this book. And on a day-to-day basis, well, not every day, but a couple of times a week, I go into the classroom. And there's a much more immediate gratification because every semester, as you said, I've been teaching here since 2017. Every semester, I have a handful of students who are just a joy to teach. They're present, they've done the readings, they engage, not always with questions, but with their body language and their eye contact. And that is something that keeps me going on a day-to-day or a weekly basis. And I would say that it is actually related to my book, which is the subject of our conversation today, because I am firmly convinced that I'm a better writer because I am a teacher. You know, I teach broad 20th century world politics, a survey course for second-year undergraduates. And I think that having to see what works in the classroom, see what arguments and what turns of phrase really capture the student's attention, that's something that helped me work out questions of scope in the book.
Thank you for answering our questions. That's all we're going to ask.
Well, thank you for your time and for your interest in my work.